Did you know some nuns in the Middle Ages believed they could taste the sweetness of heaven by merely being near a saint's bone? Or that tiny vials, said to hold the Virgin Mary's breast milk, were so precious that nuns would risk everything to protect them. And hold on to your wimples, because one of the most sought-after relics was believed to be the actual foreskin of baby Jesus, with several convents claiming they had the real deal. Number 10. The myriad bones of Saint Ursula and her 11,000 virgins. Okay, so picture this. Not just one relic, but literally thousands. We're talking about Saint Ursula and her legendary 11,000 virgin companions. The story goes that Ursula, a British princess, set off on a pilgrimage to Rome with a massive entourage of 11,000. Yep, you read that right. 11,000 virgins. On their way back, they supposedly sailed up the Rhine River to Cologne, Germany. Bad idea. Cologne, at that time, was under siege by Huns. The Huns, not being big fans of Christian virgins apparently, martyred the whole lot of them. Tragic, right? But here's where it gets wild for medieval folks, especially nuns. Cologne became a massive relic hotspot. Starting in the 12th century, a huge burial ground was discovered near the city, and it was immediately identified as the resting place of Ursula and her virgin army. Bones, bones, and more bones were unearthed. Skulls, femurs, ribs, you name it. These weren't just any old bones. They were the sacred remains of virgin martyrs, which made them super powerful in the eyes of the faithful. Convents, particularly those dedicated to female saints or those housing virgin nuns, were desperate to get their hands on these relics. Imagine a community of nuns who had themselves taken vows of chastity, having physical pieces of these ultimate role models. It was like having a direct line to heavenly inspiration. Nuns would pray before these bones, believing they could gain strength in their own spiritual struggles and emulate the steadfast faith of Ursula and her companions. The sheer quantity of relics was astounding. Churches and chapels were decorated with them. Some accounts describe entire walls lined with skulls or intricate patterns made from various bones. The nunnery of Saint Ursula in Cologne itself became a major pilgrimage site, and you can bet the nuns there were deeply involved in the care and veneration of these remains. They would have cleaned them, perhaps wrapped them in precious silks, and arranged them for display. For nuns across Europe, acquiring even a small fragment of a bone from one of these 11,000 virgins was a huge spiritual win. It was a tangible connection to a vast company of heavenly protectors, women who had chosen faith and purity over life itself. The devotion was intense, and the stories surrounding these relics, like how they were miraculously discovered or how they performed healings, only added to their mystique and desirability for religious women seeking a closer connection to the divine. Number 9. The steadfast skull of Saint Agnes. Saint Agnes of Rome is one of those OG Christian martyrs, and her story is pretty intense. We're talking early 4th century, a young girl traditionally only about 12 or 13 years old, who refused to marry a Roman prefect's son because she had dedicated her virginity to Christ. Talk about commitment. The Romans tried everything to break her spirit. They threatened her, tried to force her into a brothel. Legend says her hair miraculously grew to cover her body, and an angel protected her, and finally she was martyred, either by beheading or stabbing in the throat. Because of her youth, purity, and unwavering faith, she became a mega popular saint, especially for young women, and you guessed it, nuns. Her relics, particularly her skull, became incredibly revered. The primary claim for her skull rests in Rome, at the Church of Agnes in Agon, built over the traditional site of the brothel where she was exposed. Imagine medieval nuns, perhaps, on a rare and arduous pilgrimage to Rome, finally coming face to face with the actual head of this young saint they so admired. It would have been an electrifying experience. They saw in Agnes a model of perfect virtue, someone who embodied the ideals of chastity and devotion that were central to their own monastic lives. Nuns would have prayed fervently before such a relic, asking for St. Agnes's intercession to help them maintain their own vows and live lives of holiness. They might have touched their rosaries or personal items to the reliquary containing the skull, hoping to imbue them with some of its sacred power. For nuns who couldn't travel to Rome, even hearing stories about the skull, or perhaps venerating a secondary relic, something that had touched the primary relic, would have been deeply meaningful. In convents dedicated to St. Agnes, or those that managed to acquire a fragment of her bone or even dust from her tomb, these relics would have been the spiritual heart of the community. Nuns would have composed hymns and prayers in her honor, held special feast day celebrations, and looked to her example during times of trial. The skull, as the vessel of her thoughts and her resolute will, was a potent symbol of her spiritual strength. It wasn't just a bone. It was a tangible link to a girl who stared down the Roman Empire for her faith, and for medieval nuns, that was some serious pound goals. The reverence wasn't morbid. It was about connecting with the spirit and fortitude of a beloved saint who understood their deepest commitments. Number 8, the miraculous body, and sometimes just a finger, of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. Saint Catherine of Alexandria was another superstar saint for medieval folks, and especially for nuns. Her story is legendary. A super-smart, noble-born Egyptian woman from the 4th century who debated and defeated 50 pagan philosophers summoned by Emperor Maxentius. When she refused to renounce her Christian faith and marry the emperor, he condemned her to be broken on a spiked wheel. But get this, when she touched the wheel, it miraculously shattered. So, they just beheaded her instead. After her death, angels, supposedly, carried her body to Mount Sinai. Centuries later, monks at the monastery built there discovered her remains, from which it was said a healing oil constantly flowed. This oil, along with her actual bones, became some of the most prized relics in Christendom. Nuns, who often valued learning and wisdom, many nunneries were centers of education for women, deeply admired St. Catherine for her intellect and eloquence, as well as her steadfast faith and purity. She was the patron saint of philosophers, theologians, unmarried girls, students, and, significantly, those who worked with wheels, which made her story extra dramatic. Convents across Europe vied to obtain relics of St. Catherine. Even a tiny bone fragment, or a phial of the manna or oil, said to exude from her tomb on Mount Sinai, was considered a treasure. Nuns would anoint the sick with this oil, believing in its potent healing properties. They would pray to St. Catherine for wisdom in their studies. Yes, nuns studied. For strength in their faith and for protection. Imagine a convent that was lucky enough to possess, say, a finger bone of St. Catherine. The nuns would have enshrined it beautifully, perhaps, in a reliquary shaped like a hand or a small chapel. On her feast day, there would be elaborate processions and services. Nuns might have special prayers or litanies dedicated to her, reflecting on her courage before the emperor and her miraculous triumph over the torture device. For nuns, St. Catherine wasn't just a historical figure. She was a powerful heavenly advocate, a woman of immense spiritual and intellectual strength, whose relics provided a direct connection to her patronage and her story of divine intervention. The idea that angels themselves had cared for her body added an extra layer of awe and reverence. Her relics were a reminder that even in the face of brutal opposition, faith and wisdom could prevail, often in miraculous ways. Number 7. The holy lance that pierced Christ's side. Okay, this one is straight from the Passion story, the spear used by the Roman soldier Longinus to pierce Jesus' side as he hung on the cross. John's Gospel mentions it, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a lance, and immediately there came out blood and water. This makes the Holy Lance, or Spear of Destiny, as it's sometimes called, a super significant relic because it directly touched Christ and was involved in the culmination of his sacrifice. Now, there wasn't just one Holy Lance floating around. Several places claimed to have the lance, or at least a significant part of it. The most famous one in the medieval West was probably the one that ended up in the hands of the Holy Roman emperors. Another prominent contender was the lance discovered in Antioch during the First Crusade, which was said to have miraculously rallied the Crusaders to victory. For medieval nuns whose spiritual lives often revolved intensely around the suffering of Christ, think of the visions of mystics like Hadduwich or Julian of Norwich. A relic like the Holy Lance was profoundly moving. It was a physical object that inflicted one of the final wounds on their Savior. Contemplating, it would have brought the reality of the crucifixion into sharp focus. Nuns would meditate on the pain Christ endured, the love demonstrated by his sacrifice, and the mystery of the blood and water that flowed from his side, often interpreted as symbols of the Eucharist and baptism. If a convent was anywhere near a church or treasury that housed such a lance, or even a fragment believed to be from it, the nuns might undertake special devotions. They might participate in processions on Good Friday, where the lance or a replica was venerated. They would pray for a deeper understanding of Christ's passion and for the grace to bear their own sufferings in union with his. The stories surrounding the lances, like the one from Antioch leading to military victory, added to their power. While nuns were generally involved in battles, they were certainly engaged in spiritual warfare, and such a relic could be seen as a powerful weapon against evil and a source of divine aid for the church and for their own community. The Holy Lance wasn't just a historical packet, it was a conduit to the very heart of Christian faith, the suffering, death, and redemptive power of Jesus. For nuns dedicated to a life of prayer and contemplation of these mysteries, it was an object of awe-inspiring and perhaps even terrifying sanctity. Number 6. A single sacred thorn from Christ's crown of thorns. Imagine the scene: Roman soldiers mocking Jesus, pressing a twisted crown of sharp thorns onto his head. It's one of the most poignant and brutal images from the Passion. So, naturally, the crown of thorns itself became an incredibly important relic. The most famous one was acquired by King Louis IX of France in the 13th century, and he built the stunning Sainte-Chapelle in Paris to house it. But here's the thing, that crown over time was said to have had its thorns plucked off and distributed as individual relics. And these individual thorns, oh boy, they were like spiritual gold. Kings, queens, Powerful nobles, and yes, major monasteries and convents, all clamored to get one. For a community of medieval nuns possessing a thorn believed to be from Christ's actual crown of thorns was an almost unbelievable privilege. It was a direct physical link to his suffering, a tangible piece of the instrument of his torture. Nuns would have venerated such a thorn with intense devotion. Picture it, carefully preserved in an elaborate reliquary, perhaps made of gold and crystal, displayed on the altar on special feast days, especially during Holy Week. Nuns would kneel before it for hours, meditating on Christ's agony, his patience, and his love for humanity. They might kiss the reliquary or touch their prayer beads to it, seeking to draw spiritual strength from its proximity to Christ's pain. The devotion wasn't about glorifying suffering for its own sake, but about entering into empathy with Christ. Many medieval nuns like Mechthild of Magdeburg or Bridget of Sweden had powerful visions of the Passion, and a relic like a holy thorn would have served as a focal point for such contemplative experiences. It made the distant historical event immediate and personal. They might pray for the conversion of sinners, for relief for the suffering in the world, or for the grace to endure their own personal trials with Christ like fortitude. These thorns were also associated with miracles. Stories circulated of thorns that miraculously bled, or that brought healing to the sick. For a convent, having such a relic not only deepened their spiritual life, but also elevated their status, and could attract pilgrims and patrons. The nuns would be the guardians of this sacred object, responsible for its care and for fostering devotion to it. It was a heavy responsibility, but also a profound source of spiritual power and connection to the very core of their faith. The sacrificial love of Christ made heart-wrenchingly real by a tiny, sharp piece of wood. Number 5. The comforting girdle or belt of the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary was, without a doubt, the ultimate female role model for medieval nuns. She was the Mother of God, the Queen of Heaven, the epitome of purity, humility, and grace. So, any relic associated with her was incredibly precious. One of the most intimate and revered of these was her girdle or belt, known in Latin as the Sacra Cintola or Zonam Beatae Mariae Virginis. The story goes that when Mary was assumed into heaven, she supposedly dropped her girdle down to the Apostle Thomas, yes, doubting Thomas, as proof of her bodily assumption. This girdle then became a super important relic. The most famous one is probably the girdle of Prato in Italy, but other churches and regions also claim to have the authentic girdle or significant portions of it. Why was a belt so important? Well, in the medieval mind, it was something Mary physically wore. It touched her body. It was associated with her pregnancy, her motherhood, and her purity. For nuns, who had dedicated their lives to virginity and spiritual motherhood, this relic was especially potent. It symbolized Mary's protection, her maternal care, and her intercession. Nuns who had access to such a relic or even a fragment would have venerated it with deep affection and reverence. The girdle was particularly invoked for protection during childbirth, which, while not directly applicable to celibate nuns, was a major concern for the laywomen they might pray for or minister to in some capacity. More broadly, it was seen as a symbol of Mary's ability to gird or protect her devotees from spiritual and physical dangers. Imagine nuns in a convent that housed such a relic. They might process with it on Marian feast days, singing hymns in her honor. They might have special prayers they recited before it, asking for Mary's guidance in their monastic life, for her help in overcoming temptations, and for her comfort in times of distress. The girdle was a tangible link to the most compassionate and powerful woman in their spiritual universe. Some convents might have even created contact relics by touching pieces of cloth or other belts to the original girdle, thereby believing some of its sanctity was transferred. These could then be distributed or used within the community. For medieval nuns, Mary's girdle wasn't just an old piece of fabric. It was a warm, maternal embrace from heaven, a symbol of her ever-present help and her perfect example of womanly virtue. Devotion to it would have been a cornerstone of their Marian piety, filling their hearts with hope and a sense of closeness to the Mother of God. Number 4. Sacred threads from the Virgin Mary's veil or robe. Following closely on the heels of Mary's girdle in terms of intimacy and reverence were relics said to be actual pieces of her clothing, specifically her veil or her robe. Think about it. These were garments that were believed to have touched her skin, to have been worn by the Mother of God during her earthly life, perhaps even while she was nursing the infant Jesus or standing at the foot of the cross. The emotional and spiritual charge of such items for medieval believers, especially nuns, was immense. One of the most famous Marian textile relics is the Sancta Camisa, Holy Tunic, housed in Chartres Cathedral in France. Legend says it was the tunic Mary wore at the Annunciation or during Christ's birth. While Chartres was a cathedral, not a nunnery, the devotion it inspired rippled throughout the Christian world, and nunneries would have deeply shared in this reverence. Many other places claim to have smaller fragments, a few threads, a small square of fabric, from Mary's veil, her cloak, or other garments. For medieval nuns, these textile relics offered a profound connection to Mary's humility, her daily life, and her maternal presence. A veil, in particular, was a potent symbol. Nuns themselves wore veils as a sign of their consecration and modesty, so a relic of Mary's veil would have resonated deeply with their own lived experience and spiritual identity. It was a link to Mary, not just as the Queen of Heaven, but as a woman who lived a life of prayer and service on earth. Nuns lucky enough to be in a community that possessed such a fragment would have treated it with the utmost care and veneration. It would be encased in a beautiful reliquary, perhaps one that allowed the delicate threads to be seen. They would pray before it, asking Mary to clothe them in her virtues, to shield them with her protection, and to guide them in their imitation of her life. These relics were often associated with miracles of protection, especially for women and children. Stories would abound of how a town or a community was saved from fire, plague, or attack through the intercession of Mary, often attributed to the presence of her sacred garment. Nuns would have been fervent in their prayers to activate such protection for their own convent and the wider world. Holding or even just gazing upon a few threads believed to have been worn by the Virgin Mary would have been an incredibly moving experience for a medieval nun. It made Mary feel incredibly close, almost touchable. It was a reminder of her humanity, her earthly journey, and her constant, loving presence in their lives. These weren't just threads, they were threads of hope, faith, and profound spiritual connection to the most revered woman in Christianity. Number 3. The miraculous milk of the Virgin Mary. Lac Sanctae Maria. Okay, get ready, because this one is truly unique and was incredibly popular in the Middle Ages, especially in female monastic communities. We're talking about relics of the Virgin Mary's breast milk, the Lac Sanctae Mariae, or Heilige Milch. Yes, actual milk, or at least what was believed to be her milk, preserved usually as a whitish, chalky substance in small glass vials or reliquaries. How on earth did this become a relic? Well, the stories vary. Some legends say that drops of Mary's milk fell onto a stone in a grotto in Bethlehem while she was nursing the infant Jesus, and this stone or scrapings from it mixed with other substances became the source of the relic. Other tales involve miraculous appearances of Mary where she offered her milk. Regardless of the origin story, these relics were widespread and deeply cherished. For medieval nuns, this relic was profoundly significant for several reasons. Firstly, it was an incredibly intimate connection to Mary's motherhood and her nurturing of Christ. Nuns, while celibate, often cultivated a strong sense of spiritual motherhood, seeing themselves as nurturing souls through prayer and devotion. Mary's milk symbolized this ultimate act of loving sustenance. Secondly, the devotion to Mary's milk was often linked to mystical experiences. Some nuns, like the famous 13th century Cistercian mystic Saint Luckert of Awer, reported visions where the Virgin Mary or even Christ himself offered them spiritual nourishment from the breast. Some nuns even believed they experienced mystical lactation after intense prayer and veneration of such relics, feeling a sweetness or a flow of grace. This wasn't seen as bizarre, but as a profound sign of divine favor and intimate union with the divine. Convents that possessed a relic of Mary's milk would have considered it one of their greatest treasures. It would be housed in a precious container, perhaps adorned with pearls or crystals to mimic drops of milk. Nuns would pray before it for spiritual nourishment, for maternal protection from Mary, and for a deeper understanding of the Incarnation, the mystery of God becoming human, fed and cared for by a human mother. These relics were also associated with healing, particularly for ailments related to nursing or for sick children. Nuns might pray for laywomen in their community, invoking the power of Mary's holy milk. The substance itself was a powerful symbol of life, purity, and divine grace flowing through the Virgin Mary. While it might seem strange to our modern sensibilities for medieval nuns, the milk of the Virgin Mary was a deeply moving and spiritually potent relic, connecting them to the most tender and nurturing aspects of their beloved Queen of Heaven and the infancy of Christ. It was a taste of heavenly sweetness, a sign of God's willingness to be vulnerable and dependent, and a source of profound spiritual comfort and inspiration for women dedicated to a life of divine love. Number 2. A precious fragment of the true cross. Of all the relics associated with Christ's passion, perhaps none was more universally revered than the true cross, the actual wooden cross upon which Jesus was crucified. According to legend, it was discovered in Jerusalem in the 4th century by Saint Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine. She supposedly found 3 crosses buried and identified the true cross when it miraculously healed a sick woman or raised a dead person. From that moment on, pieces of this wood became the ultimate Christian relic. Over the centuries, fragments of the true cross were distributed throughout Christendom. Kings, emperors, great cathedrals, and significantly, major monasteries and convents sought to acquire even the tiniest splinter. For medieval nuns, whose spirituality was often deeply centered on the crucifixion and the redeeming sacrifice of Christ, possessing a relic of the true cross was an unparalleled spiritual treasure. Imagine a community of nuns having a small, perhaps inch-long piece of dark wood, identified as part of the very instrument of salvation. It would be their most sacred possession, housed in an elaborate reliquary, often shaped like a cross itself, made of gold or silver and adorned with gemstones. This wasn't just an object. It was a direct physical link to the central event of their faith. Nuns would venerate this relic with profound awe and devotion. On Good Friday, the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross, and other special occasions, the relic would be brought out for public veneration. Nuns would kneel before it, kiss the reliquary, and meditate on the immense suffering Christ endured for humanity. They would pray for forgiveness of sins, for strength in their own spiritual journeys, and for the salvation of the world. The presence of a true cross relic was believed to offer powerful protection. Convents would feel shielded from evil, from plague, from disaster. Miracles of healing were often attributed to its presence. Nuns might touch rosaries, crucifixes, or other devotional items to the reliquary, believing that some of its sanctity would be transferred. For mystical nuns, contemplating the true cross could lead to profound spiritual experiences. They might have visions of the crucifixion or feel a deep sense of union with Christ's suffering and love. The wood itself, rough and humble, yet the means of ultimate glory, was a powerful symbol of the Christian paradox of suffering leading to redemption. The nuns would be the guardians of this piece of sacred history, responsible for its preservation and for fostering devotion to it within their community and among any lay people who came to venerate it. It was a constant, tangible reminder of the price of salvation and the depth of God's love. For medieval nuns, a fragment of the true cross wasn't just a relic, it was the heart of their faith made visible, a source of endless contemplation, comfort, and spiritual power. Number 1. The utterly unique holy prepuce, Christ's foreskin. All right, brace yourselves, because this is arguably one of the most talked about and to some most unusual relics of the medieval period. The holy prepuce, or the sacred foreskin of Jesus Christ. According to Jewish law, male infants are circumcised on the 8th day after birth. Since Jesus was born a Jew, it was believed he too underwent this ritual. The tiny piece of flesh removed during the ceremony was for many medieval Christians the first blood Christ shed for humanity, and thus an incredibly sacred relic. Now you might be thinking, wait, what? But yes, this was a big deal. Multiple churches and abbeys across Europe, at least a dozen, maybe more, claimed to possess the authentic holy prepuce. Charlemagne was said to have received it as a gift, and later gave it to Pope Leo III. Other notable sites included the Abbey of Cherruy in France, an abbey in Cologne, Antwerp, and later the Lateran Basilica in Rome. For medieval nuns, especially those with a deep mystical bent, this relic held a particular and very intimate significance. It was a relic of Christ's infancy, his humanity, and his embodiment. Saint Catherine of Siena, a highly influential mystic and lay Dominican, though deeply connected to monastic ideals, famously described a mystical marriage to Christ, where he gave her a ring, sometimes interpreted by her followers and later commentators as being made from his holy foreskin. Another mystic, the 13th century Beguine Agnes Blanbekin of Vienna, recorded intensely vivid visions and spiritual experiences focused on the holy prepuce, describing its divine sweetness and its spiritual importance. For her, it was a source of profound spiritual joy and connection to Christ's physical presence on earth. Nuns and communities that claimed to house this relic, or even those who simply venerated it through devotion, would have seen it as a powerful symbol of Christ's willingness to become fully human, to share in human flesh and experience. It was a focal point for meditating on the Incarnation. Prayers and hymns were composed in its honor. The feast of the circumcision of Christ on January 1st was a major celebration, and if a convent believed it had this relic, it would be the star of the show. The relic was often credited with miracles, particularly related to fertility, though this would be more for lay patrons than for celibate nuns, and protection. The intense devotion it inspired, especially among female mystics who sought a deeply personal and embodied relationship with Christ, highlights how physical relics could serve as powerful conduits for spiritual experience. The holy prepuce was displayed in elaborate reliquaries, often with great ceremony. Its veneration was a testament to the medieval desire to connect with every aspect of Christ's life, from his miraculous birth to his sacrificial death. For nuns who dedicated their lives to Christ as their spiritual spouse, this relic, representing his earliest physical sacrifice and his complete humanity, was a profound and uniquely intimate object of devotion, sparking some of the most fervent and personal expressions of faith in the medieval era.